Welcome to another deep dive today, and we've got a really interesting one, I think.
Yeah.
This time we're looking at the Sri Lankan Tamil community, and
Specifically in Jaffna.
yeah, Jaffna and the caste system there, but with a bit of a twist.
Yeah.
So we're focusing on a group called the Koviyar
Mm-hmm.
and the relationship with the Vellalar caste,
Right.
which has been traditionally seen as the dominant caste in that area.
Yes.
But what's really interesting here is how this kind of challenges the way we usually think about like a really strict or rigid caste hierarchy.
Absolutely. I mean, we often think of caste as something that's very fixed and impermeable, but when you look at the Koviyar experience, it reveals a much more complex and nuanced reality.
Yeah, for sure. So to get started, maybe you can talk about their origins, because all our sources seem to point to a connection to the Sinhalese Govigama caste,
Right.
who were historically farmers and landholders.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like a pretty significant link, right? Because the Govigama are a huge caste within Sinhalese society.
Yeah, absolutely. And it raises a lot of interesting questions.
Yeah, so speaking of those questions,
Yeah.
one historian, Mudaliar Rasanwargam, he suggests that there was this period where Sinhalese people were being expelled from the Jaffna kingdom,
Right.
and some Govigama, they actually chose to stay.
Interesting.
And in doing so, they ended up becoming indentured to Tamil Vellalar families.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating idea, isn't it? Because it suggests a real transition
Yeah.
from a position of potential land ownership,
Right.
agricultural prominence, to one of servitude within a different
Wow.
ethnic and caste structure.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
To go from, potentially owning land to serving another group, even within a different caste system like that, raises so many questions about their motivations and the power dynamics at play.
Precisely. It makes you wonder, what were the pressures and opportunities present at that time? Were the Koviyar seeking some kind of protection or stability
Yeah,
by aligning themselves with the Velar?
it's a good question.
And what did the Velar gain from this arrangement?
Yeah.
It really complicates the idea of caste as just a purely hierarchical system.
For sure, and that complexity seems to be reflected in this Koviyar-Velar relationship, because
Right.
it doesn't sound like it was just this straightforward master-slave dynamic either.
Yeah.
Rasanayagam, in his observations, he actually noted a certain level of equality between them.
Mm.
Now, that word equality in this context is just fascinating.
Yeah.
How can we even think about the concept of equality within a caste system,
Yeah.
especially when you consider the Koviyar's historical position as these indentured servants?
It's a real paradox, isn't it?
It is.
Maybe equality in this case didn't actually mean equal social standing,
Okay.
but rather a recognition of their interdependence and a kind of shared experience.
I see.
And to really understand this, we need to look at specific practices.
Right.
Like, for instance, the Koviyar, they played important roles in Velar death rituals.
Interesting.
They were responsible for carrying the deceased and performing laments, activities that are so deeply ingrained in these cultural and spiritual beliefs.
Oh, for sure. And there's also that really interesting detail about how Velar women, they would initially lament alongside Koviyar women.
Yes.
And they would even address them with a phrase that translates to, "O Sinhalese,"
Right.
which seems to suggest this acknowledgement of their shared history.
Exactly. The fact that they're sharing this ritual space,
Yeah.
the act of lamenting together, it really suggests a level of intimacy
Mm-hmm.
and this blurring of those very strict social demarcations.
And even the use of that phrase, "O Sinhalese," is interesting.
Yes, very much so.
I mean, was it just a simple acknowledgement of their perceived origin, or did it actually carry deeper emotional and social weight?
That's a really good question.
Like, it seems like more than just a casual observation to bring in that kind of cultural and linguistic element during such a significant ritual.
It definitely does, and it reinforces this idea that the Koviyar-Velar relationship was far more nuanced
Right.
than we might initially think. And this shared ritual space may have even served to challenge or at least complicate the existing social order.
Challenging the social order through a death ritual. That's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out?
Well, think about it for a moment. The very act of Velar women sharing that space with Koviyar women
Wow.
and using a phrase that's tied to their perceived Sinhalese heritage could be seen as subtly subverting that rigid caste hierarchy.
Okay.
It acknowledges a kind of shared humanity and connection that goes beyond these social constructs.
That makes sense. It's like these rituals became a space where those societal norms could be momentarily suspended,
Yeah,
or at least reinterpreted.
precisely. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to our understanding of how caste actually operated in practice.
Right, not just the theory.
Exactly.
It makes me think about how these seemingly small details, like a phrase during a ritual, can reveal so much about the underlying social dynamics.
Yeah.
It's a reminder to look beyond the surface when we're trying to understand these complex systems.
Absolutely, and this is just the beginning.
All right.
We haven't even touched on the Koviyar's role in Velar social events, which adds another dimension to their integrated position within the community.
And that sounds like a great place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
So for our listener today, we've been talking about the really intricate story of the Koviyar people within the Sri Lankan Tamil caste system. And we've seen how their potential origins, their unique relationship with the Velar caste, and even their participation in these death rituals challenge our understanding of caste as this fixed and purely hierarchical system. So join us in part 2, where we'll continue exploring this story and what it all means for how we think about caste and social dynamics.
So picking up where we left off, the Koviyar's role in Velar social life is
Okay.
another aspect that really challenges that view of caste as strictly hierarchical.
Right.
They served as cooks and servers at Velar weddings and other important social events, which
Right.
really put them at the heart of these communal gatherings.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about their role in those events, especially when you consider how food and its preparation are so often tied to cultural and social norms.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just a general role either. Koviyar women specifically were entrusted with this crucial task of cooking in Velar homes.
So they were the cooks.
Yeah, and this exclusivity is really intriguing. Was it born out of necessity
Right.
or dictated by tradition, or did it maybe represent some form of social control?
Yeah, that's a really complex issue. On the one hand, it could just be a practical arrangement,
Oh.
based on the historical context of their relationship.
Mm.
But then on the other hand, assigning such a specific and important role like that exclusively to Koviyar women does suggest a deeper social dynamic at play.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the implications of that exclusivity. Did it reinforce certain social boundaries,
Yeah.
even while demonstrating a level of trust and reliance on the Koviyar within those Velar households?
It kind of reminds me of how certain culinary traditions are so often guarded really closely within families and communities passed down through generations.
Right.
So was there a sense of that with the Koviyar women and their culinary role in Velar homes?
It's certainly possible. These culinary practices could have been a way for them to maintain their own cultural identity
Oh, okay.
and transmit knowledge within the Koviyar community, even as they were operating within that Velar social sphere.
So we're seeing these historical connections, these shared rituals, and even culinary practices that are intertwining the Koviyar and the Velar. It paints a much more intricate picture than a simple rigid caste hierarchy would allow.
Precisely. And there's one more detail I think is really fascinating that ties back to their potential Sinhalese roots.
Okay.
The way Koviyar women drape their saris, even today, they wear the inner drape called the thundu over their shoulder, very much like Sinhalese women.
Oh, yeah, the thundu. I remember that. That's the lower garment of the sari.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting how something like that, such a seemingly small element of clothing,
Right.
can act as this visual marker of cultural identity.
Yeah, across generations even.
And within a dominant culture that's different from their own.
Yeah, it speaks to the resilience of culture.
Yeah.
How it can be both adaptive and enduring despite their integration into Tamil society. They've in some ways retained elements of that Sinhalese heritage, showcasing the fluidity and complexity of cultural identity.
It makes you think about other examples where those elements from a community's past continue to influence their present, even in subtle ways.
Yeah.
It really highlights how cultural identity isn't static, but rather this evolving tapestry woven with threads from all sorts of different sources.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to our central question.
Yeah.
How does the Koviyar story challenge our understanding of caste as this rigid hierarchy?
Right.
We've seen how their potential origins, their unique relationship with the Velar, and even their cultural practices point to a much more fluid and nuanced reality.
It's clear that the Koviyar hold a unique and really complex place within the Jaffna Tamil caste system.
Yes.
And their story makes us rethink our assumptions about these social structures
Yeah.
and how they actually work in practice.
Yeah.
But what about today?
Right.
How has this situation evolved for the Koviyar in contemporary Sri Lanka?
That's a great question. And it leads us to think about how caste itself is evolving in modern society.
Okay.
While those traditional structures and practices might still be around, the socio-political landscape has shifted considerably,
Of course.
which influences those dynamics of caste.
So are those vestiges of Sinhalese culture still prevalent among the Koviyar today? Are those culinary traditions still being passed down? And how has the relationship between the Koviyar and the Vellalar changed in the context of modern Sri Lanka?
Those are all important questions, and unfortunately, our current sources don't really give us detailed insight into that contemporary situation.
Okay.
However, it's this gap in our understanding
Right.
that I think makes the Koviyar story even more compelling.
It does leave us wanting to know more.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating glimpse into the complexities of caste and identity. But it also prompts us to consider how these dynamics are playing out right now.
It does, and I think that's one of the most valuable things about exploring topics like this. It's not just about uncovering the past, but recognizing how it informs our understanding of the present and the future.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of continued research and exploration.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, there's one more aspect of the Koviyar story I'd like to touch on.
Okay.
The concept of social mobility within these caste structures.
Yes, that's crucial.
Given their historical position, how has that concept of social mobility played out for the Koviyar community? Have there been opportunities for advancement or shifts in their social standing?
Again, our sources mainly focus on the historical context, so we don't have a very clear picture of social mobility in more recent times.
I see.
However, it's definitely a question worth pondering.
It is, and it leads us to think about the broader implications of the Koviyar story.
Right.
What does their experience tell us about the potential for change and evolution within caste systems?
That's a big question,
Yeah,
and I think it deserves further exploration.
for sure.
Koviyar's story, with all its nuances and complexities, it challenges us to think critically about social structures and the possibilities for transformation.
And for our listener today, we've been delving deeper into the captivating story of the Koviyar people within the Sri Lankan Tamil caste system and their journey from potential Sinhalese origins to their unique relationship with the Vellalar caste offers this really fascinating lens through which to examine the complexities of caste and identity. And we've seen how their story challenges those assumptions about rigid hierarchies, and it sheds light on the fluidity of social dynamics, even within systems that are often seen as fixed and unchanging. So join us in part 3, where we'll conclude our deep dive and explore what the Koviyar story means for understanding caste in the modern world. So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into this whole world of the Koviyar, I keep thinking about how their story really pushes us to reconsider those big assumptions we often have about caste systems.
Yeah.
Like, it's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking about them as just rigid, unchanging structures.
Right.
But the Koviyar example really shows just how dynamic things actually were and potentially still are.
Absolutely. Their story highlights the problems with just looking at caste through this lens of hierarchy and fixed social positions.
Right.
We've seen how their history, their cultural practices, even those little nuances of their relationship with the Velar, they all challenge those simple ideas.
And thinking about the Koviyar's possible journey, transitioning from a potentially landowning Sinhalese caste to this position of servitude within Tamil society.
Right.
It raises all these questions about social mobility, like how did that function? Or did it even function within these systems?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what factors might have allowed for any shifts in social standing, even within what we see as a rigid framework.
I think the Koviyar story in a lot of ways really shows the importance of context.
Okay.
The historical circumstances around their integration into Tamil society, the dynamics of their relationship with the Velar, even just holding on to certain cultural practices.
Right.
All of that gives us a more nuanced understanding of their place in the caste system.
It's a good reminder that these systems weren't just static monoliths.
No.
They were complex, evolving social structures shaped by so many different things.
Exactly. And while our sources don't give us a ton of insight into what's going on with the Koviyar today,
Yeah, that's true.
their story really makes us think about the bigger picture of caste in the modern world.
Oh, sure.
Like, how have these systems adapted to changing social, economic, political landscapes?
Right. Are those historical relationships and power dynamics still relevant today?
Yeah,
Have we seen big shifts in social mobility within these communities?
these are all questions that we need to keep exploring.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the Koviyar story gives us a really good starting point for those bigger conversations.
I agree.
It challenges us to move beyond just generalizations and really engage with the complexities of what caste actually means as a lived experience.
Their story reminds us that even within what might seem like a rigid social structure,
Mm.
there are these narratives of resilience and adaptation and maybe even transformation.
Yeah, it encourages us to really dig deeper, look beyond just the surface, and question what we think we know about how these systems work.
Yeah, both historically and today.
And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive into the world of the Koviyar has really sparked your curiosity
Yeah.
and encouraged you to think critically about those complexities of caste and identity.
It's a story that raises more questions than it answers.
For sure.
And I think that's what makes it so compelling.
What other hidden stories are out there waiting to be uncovered?
Right. What other perspectives could challenge our understanding of these intricate social systems?
The journey of exploration continues, and we really encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep searching for those deeper insights.
We'll be back with another deep dive soon, ready to unearth more fascinating stories and shed some light on the hidden complexities of our world. Until then, keep exploring. And shed some light on the hidden complexities of our world. Until then, keep exploring.